Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, I assure you. But here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming, especially during these past 2 years. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, and Talking Toddlers, this podcast helps you develop that with clarity, confidence, and clear communication. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Talking Toddlers. I'm Erin, your host, and this week I'm going to jump on here and discuss developmental milestones. Are they important? Should I be concerned? Are they outdated? Or don't kids just kind of grow at their own pace? And who decides about these milestones? You may have heard recently, I say maybe within the last 6 months, that the CDC did modify their developmental expectations or milestones. And there was some, what shall we say, heated debate. And it really made several of us in my field jump up and take notice. So today's session is not necessarily talking or diving deep into what the CDC did or didn't do or the pros and cons to that. But I'm going to start this conversation with what are developmental milestones? And like I asked in the very beginning, are they important? Are they outdated? What should we do as parents to use them effectively? And so, again, the CDC, there was a lot of concern and questions and inquiry. And it's still being challenged, mind you, and it hasn't been settled. So I want parents to take everything with a grain of salt and perhaps look at, websites or links before 2020. And I will, in a future episode, maybe dive deeper with how those changes came to be. But my first, and many people in my field jumped in because my first concern was, wow, they had a team of maybe, I think, 12, 14 quote unquote professionals. Not a single one of them was a speech language pathologist. And believe me, we have thousands of SLPs, that's a speech language pathologist. We have researchers, universities, even though there's always been a huge shortage of licensed practitioners like myself. The CDC didn't even bother asking us. So that's a whole different episode. Today, I want to kind of start this series. And as I was doing research and organizing my thoughts, I'm like, well, I think it's important that we do a series. And so today I'm going to talk about or introduce what are developmental milestones, how should parents really use them proactively and informatively, and not rely, quote unquote, on the outside systems. Because as I dive into this whole podcast and Talking Toddlers and really helping clear some of the clutter and the noise out there, because as we all agree, there's a bunch of noise out there and a lot of bad information. But even with that, one of the things that I continually go back on is that parents, you need to step up. You need to be proactive. You need to think preventively. You need to take that big P in parenthood and embrace it, right? With being purposeful and proactive and to prevent and to be playful and all of those P's that I am kind of implementing in all the work that I do. And so what today's episode is focusing in are 3 big takeaways. 1, be your own detective. 2, sweeping generalizations are very misleading. And 3, don't wait and see. And I say that with the caveat that the CDC came up with these quote unquote changes or updates, hoping to encourage both professionals, mostly pediatricians or educators, and the parents at large to not take a wait and see. And yet the changes that they made really caused many concerns, generated numerous questions, and at this time in mid-July, they're still being challenged. This episode is not going to be all about that. There will be a future one where we will look into how the CDC kind of set it up, what data they tried to use or reference, and why primarily speech language pathologists and occupational therapists are questioning their intent, I guess one could say. But today I want to focus on how parents, you, mom and dad, grandparents, and even, daycare providers or preschoolers, how we, us outside people doing the real work, can be better informed and remain proactive. Because, in a nutshell, the primary concern I have, and many of my colleagues, is that when the CDC decided to change the milestones and change the expectations of what is typical or expected for a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, they never once talked to a speech language pathologist, didn't reference any of our studies. And how this is generated is that we look at these milestones as a range, right? Kids will have a little wiggle room, whether it's 3 months or 6 months. Walking, for example, will take place somewhere between 10 months and 16 to 18 months. I think, historically it's been around 16 months that you would maybe pick up the phone and call someone for a consult if they're not walking by 16 or 17 months. But so there is a range, we understand that, but we still expect all of those subtle nuances or precursors, pre-steps, no pun intended, to walking to be there. Meaning a child will pull themselves up on furniture, and kind of scoot around using furniture pieces or adult legs to hold themselves. Or they might need more stability, but they're beginning to alternate that pattern. Same with speech and language. So it's not that, and I've said this in previous episodes, that all of a sudden they wake up on their first birthday and start using single words. No, there's been a lot of cooing and babbling, differentiated sounds, all of the vowels or the vast majority of the vowels, numerous early sounds that are easily made, like the M and the P. Those are when the lips come together, and the B, like in banana. And there's different vocalizations, and you can tell that they're playing with their voice and making this connection between phonation, which is when the air comes through the vocal cords and it begins to vibrate, other than crying, right? But crying is their first form of communication. They're telling us something's wrong. Come and help me. I need you. So, but there's all of these precursors. And so when we look at developmental milestones, we have to keep that in reference that there are these markers that help us identify or help us really measure how well our child is growing and developing. And we have this data collected for, I'd say at least, in the 1920s is kind of when we started doing testing, quote unquote. I'm using air marks, but, really looking at how children grow and develop, how we learn to learn, how our brain changes based on our life experience. And now in 2022, we understand epigenetics, where just because you're born with a biological predisposition does not mean that it has to manifest into something that based on your life experience and your interfacing, your engagement with the 3D world, with this three-dimensional world, do certain genetic predispositions actually come to express themselves. And so we have to be mindful, informed, and proactive as parents, educators, therapists, doctors. And so my concern has always been in 35 years, yes, pediatricians are a good first phone call, but they learn so much across the board in medical, in illness and sickness and disease and broken bones and all of that they have a very cursory perspective on development. They understand by the first birthday what a handful of markers should be ticked off of the questionnaire, right? Are they trying to say the first words? I bet if I lined up 100 pediatricians, half of them wouldn't realize that mama and dada aren't real words. Right? I mean, they ultimately become real words once they have this concept that we are given names or identified markers, right? But those aren't, as a speech pathologist, that makes a big difference. Nana for banana or wawa for water are true words other than, besides the mama and dada. And that's just one tiny, tiny little point. But knowing what to expect and when to expect it. And, it's so popular that book, that it kind of rings right here. When we're pregnant and we're, especially the first time around, we really, really study what's happening at the 6th week, what's happening at the 20th week in utero. We need to take that energy, that tenaciousness, and really use that to help our child continue to grow beyond the womb, right? I know we love them and feed them and nurse them and protect them and all of these kind of natural instincts as a family, as a new parent, but understanding, and it's not just the big ones, right? Rolling over or, crawling or taking their first step. And all of those are big ones, but we also have to understand the relationship between them. So this is where I want to kind of take an example of a very short window from a 1.5 to 2 years old. So when we as speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, we're kind of the primary gatekeepers, right? That if there's a question, then a pediatrician will refer to one of us, typically OT before a physical therapist, before a PT, because they specialize in kind of different physical aspects of the human body. And we can talk about that another time. And I have several colleagues that I will ultimately have come on this podcast, and we can have a conversation about what we're looking for and how we help certain things. So let's just narrow in on a teeny tiny window of a 1.5 to a 2.5. And I'm speaking to, that 18-month-old until a 30-month-old, because that is a huge growth spurt. But it's important to understand when we look at kids, it's a range, right? There aren't absolutes. And I think that that's where the misunderstanding, and we use phrases like, oh, all kids grow at their own pace, they're all fine. And that is not necessarily true. We have different styles, like I've said, different temperaments, and there will be some ebbs and flows. Like every single week when I meet with families, I'm constantly telling them that speech and language will often, not always, but will often take a back seat when they're going through toilet training and potty training. That speech and language will often appear more disfluent or disjointed or more anxious, like rushed, especially when they're going through toilet training, or there are big changes. Maybe it's the first time they're entering a daycare or a preschool setting, and there's a lot of new things being introduced, and their little tiny world is expanding. Their initial world is just mom and dad and being home in their little tribe, maybe some grandparents, and especially in these last couple of years, holy moly, the extended family and all of that openness has been squashed. And so I cannot tell you in the last 2 years how many new families came to me, and kids were incredibly anxious and uncomfortable, literally screaming for 30 minutes in my waiting room because of the newness of looking and being with other adults, and they've never experienced that before. So there are these ebbs and flows that we have to be respectful of, but always hold them up front and center. We want to see our kids continually moving forward. It's not a perfect linear line. It's up and down, but the trajectory is forward. And so, for example, an 18-month-old, and when you do, another little side note, when we do look at these milestones, that this is the lower range, right? It's usually looking at 25% of the students, 25% of the kids a certain age to 50%. And so that's average. It's when you think of the bell curve, that upside down bell kind of thing, 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. So, for example, a 1.5-year-old should be able to understand approximately 300 words. So, mostly nouns, but some verbs like sit down, please, or give me your foot, give me that book, that kind of understanding, and that they're able to follow some simple instructions, such as the examples I just gave you, or listen to simple stories, that they can attend to a story for about 2 to 3 minutes. And that's the low average. So there's a range. We're expecting an 18-month-old to listen with intention. And way back when, in the beginning of this podcast, my opening, I had a couple of episodes in a series talking about all the receptive language and pre-verbal communication that needs to take place before they're really using that first word. So again, at 18 months, they are beginning to play make-believe, right? They pick up, say, a big eraser and use it as a telephone. They put it up to their ear, or they, pretend to feed their teddy bear. They're beginning to do this. And what I'm encouraging parents to do is become the detective, to really, really watch your kids and don't just assume. that they're at about 18 months, they're shifting from attention to attention is a little less rapid, meaning, they're able to sustain attention for a couple of minutes while you're building blocks. And then they turn their attention to maybe the trucks, or they turn their attention to their baby doll. That they're building, it's a process, right? And so the difference between an 18-month-old where they're beginning to attend, then, in 6 months or 12 months from then they're really doing it for 8 or 10 minutes long. So there's this range, and we're always measuring in our mind, right, how they're progressing through these milestones. And I look at the whole child. And so, yes, ultimately we want them talking and having turn taking in a conversational flow. But the difference between understanding 300 words and then using approximately 50 words, that's 50, by their second birthday, again, that's low average. Many, many, many kids will have 200 words by their second birthday. So there's your range, and I just be mindful of that. So one of the things that the CDC did in their quote unquote updated milestone version is that they didn't talk about 50 words at 24 months of age. They bumped it up to 30 months of age. But we have to be respectful that for the last 60 years, 80 years, we've been expecting 2-year-olds to at least be using 50 words. And really at that same time, conceptually understand how 2 words go together, like more cookie or truck broke or daddy home, those 2 concepts. And so we have to have this building of understanding and use. So when there is a delay, when kids are not only at the low average, but below, one of the big red flags that all of us speech pathologists use, and most pediatricians, that if there's less than 50 words on their second birthday, then somebody picks up a phone and calls either a private speech pathologist or your state early intervention program. Every state has an early intervention program. The difference between, the 18-month-old or 2-year-old with 50 words to 200 words, again, that's the low average by the time that they're 2.5. So there's these big, huge jumps. And I mentioned it once or twice before in the past that there's this thing called fast mapping. And what it basically is that our brains in this age group, right, from their first birthday to their third birthday, is ripe, or it's just hot and ready, organized to acquire, take on language, their primary language and or their secondary language at the same time, if everything is healthy and wired and okay with the child. They can learn 2 languages at the same time. But they really move from about 9, 10, 12 words a day. And so the vast majority of the time, kids will only hear a word once, and they will really understand the meaning of it. And I often use different examples, but this, you could be handing someone, your little 2-year-old a glass and say, here, be careful, it's fragile. So they understand, be careful, and they assume or they deduct, this is higher order deductive reasoning, they deduct that fragile must go with be careful, that it's breakable. And so it's really amazing. And that's how these kids acquire language. They move from a handful of words on their first birthday to, anywhere between 1,500 words and 3,000 words on their third birthday. It's important. These milestones are important, and they're all interrelated. And I've talked before about how oral motor, chewing, all of the physical aspects of how we grow literally support and feed into our ability to use language, vocabulary, to think and reason and problem solve and engage with others. So, being able to use 200, 300 words by the time they're 2 to 2.5, and then begin to answer those infamous WH questions, such as, where or what. Those kind of sound a lot alike, and kids have to be able to understand. And when you say, what is this? And they say a bear versus where is your bear? And that rhymes, but where is your bear? And he'll say, oh, on the chair, or bed, sitting on the bed. And they begin to answer other functional type questions. And this is around their second to second and a half birthday, but that 24 to 30 months old, where you say, what do you do with your ears? What do you do with your eyes? And so those functions, that's a big concept. So not only do they have to understand what you're asking them, then they have to formulate an answer. Oh, I see with my eyes. I look at you with my eyes. I hear with my ear. And those words that are rhyming, and I've touched upon a little bit of rhyming, that's really important, not only as a precursor to literacy, but rhyming is a tricky business when kids are little like this, because they really have to have fine auditory discrimination. And so think of it as like a cell phone, how quick, or a computer processing system, how quick can they process that auditory bits of information and translate it? So when you say, I hear with my ear, they have to know that the difference between those two words is really about less than 25 milliseconds, where that H, which is very, very softly spoken, that their H in hear isn't there for ear. And so that, again, is a processing system that the information is being stored through your ears. Your brain is decoding it and understanding it in real time. And so all of this intricate knowledge and ability to understand, what are you asking me? How do I generate an answer? Then how is that related to the game that we're playing, right? If you're doing, like a body part game, like, where's your tummy? What's in your tummy? Food goes in my tummy. Where are your feet? What do you do with your feet? And I walk with my feet. Those concepts building, and that's what's happening between the 18 months and 30 months. And the big, huge growth of being able to process more and more auditory information, translate it, pull out what's important from what's not important, and then generate an answer for you. It's really important that you parents have a resource that you can trust, not a cursory one that's on the CDC, not a cursory little short checklist that the pediatrician might give with you or give to you. Although several years ago, I'd say maybe 10, we did start, we meaning, the allied health professionals, PT, OT, speech, all of us, our organizations put together a questionnaire for pediatricians to give, especially at that second birthday, 24 months. I think it's also for 18 months, trying to identify kids who may be, quote unquote, at risk for autism, because the numbers have skyrocketed. And unfortunately, less than 35% of pediatricians really take the time to review it with parents, and that's a shame. And parents don't always understand what's the purpose. And I think it would be much more effective if parents were given it beforehand. And I've done this with other parent questionnaire, but to be able to look at your child over time, say over 4 or 5 days, a whole week, and analyze it. And sometimes I have both the mom and the dad, so you have different perspectives too. The more information that you can have and understand, then the better and more authentic or valid is the word I was looking for, the validity of your measure. And so parents, I want you all to understand that developmental milestones they shouldn't be loosey-goosey. They shouldn't be an afterthought. And you shouldn't stress about them either. But I do think the more you understand how they all fit together and give you feedback of where your child is developmentally and what you as a family can do to help support. And, you're not going to check off every single little box. Of course not. When I give a standardized questionnaire to a family, then we're looking for when a child will get 5 or 6 in a row marked no, then that's kind of their ceiling, right? And you're going to miss a few here and a few there. That's to be expected. And then it's taken hundreds and hundreds of different studies over the last 80 years of looking at what is typical or expected or healthy, natural, whatever term you want to use for an 18-month, a 24-month, a 30-month. And then we can get a true measure of where your child is growing and developing. But there are subtle differences that make a clearer picture of where they're growing. So for example, somewhere between their second, 24 months and 30 months, they're beginning to add articles to their expressive language or their speech. For example, they'll say, here's the apple, or can I have a truck, right? So that the articles, those smaller units of grammar are being used because they're understanding what the English language structure is. That would be different in Spanish and different in French. They're also beginning to add present progressives. So I am swinging, or I am sucking up a straw, I am sitting, that whole ing, or you are swinging. It's important that they hear those smaller units of grammatical structure, and they're beginning to use them because they've heard us say that to them. Oh, look at you, you're jumping high on the trampoline. I had a little girl in here this morning, and she's like, can I go trampolining? And she was 2.5, and, I have a trampoline in my movement room, and I said, oh yes, let's go jump on the trampoline. And, I just paraphrase what the true structure is. And over time, she continues to shape it and reshape it and learn what the verb tense is. But they also add plural forms somewhere around their second, birthday. And so they would say, it's one cat or it's many cats. And to be able to hear and perceive and make that subtle difference between one single cat or you have a picture of many cats. And sometimes if they're not necessarily saying it, but you show them 2 pictures of one single cat and many, many cats. And I say, show me the cats. And if I overstress it, they'll be able to discriminate and hear the difference. And conceptually, they understand the difference. They also begin with contractions like don't, can't, it's, that's. Those contraction where they understand how those words can be melded together or contracted and used with a different intent, right? But they are also beginning to use it, and that's important. So, those first 18 months, they're hearing all of this and they're coding and mapping their primary language. And then within 3, 6, 8 months, then they're beginning to really use it and express it. And that's the big growth. But someone who's 18 months or 20 months, they're not really using that. They're beginning to use pronouns like mine, or they're beginning to use the difference pronouns between you and me. And again, I have a lot of my little kids that I see, my 2.5 and even 3-year-olds, are still confusing those pronouns. Give it to me, give it to you. Those are hard concepts, and they just have to hear it thousands and thousands of times and be able to change it in real time. But they're coding it. And so when we talk about speech and language, remember the speech are the sounds and the physical aspects, but language is really, really rich and very, very complex, and it's receptive and expressive. And then it's higher order language and interpreting it. It's thinking and reasoning and all of these kind of contemplative things. And so when we think of developmental milestones, we have to consider all of these subtle nuances. And so my purpose here today, this episode, is really to encourage parents to have a couple of different sites that they can refer to keep track, not only until that second birthday, to make sure that they're, engaged with others and playing with purpose and all of that. But for you to sleep well at night, for you to understand that you're not going to wait and see and wait till that second birthday and to have your pediatrician say, oh yeah, everything's fine. Oh, he's a boy. Boys are different. Yeah, all of those sweeping generalizations are not helpful. And a final thought on the pediatricians' well baby checkups. Keep in mind, mom and dad and primary caretakers, that these are very limited time exposures, that your pediatrician really doesn't know your child, and no one will really understand your child as well as you do, but you could even get to know your child even better with the knowledge of what are developmental milestones. How can you gauge their progress, their growth, their enhancement? Because these well baby checkups are limited in time. What if your child is just having an off day? What if the pediatrician is having an off day? There's no real time to have quality conversation with your pediatrician so you can explain what's going on if you have concerns or how you really think they're doing. There's no rapport between the pediatrician and your child. There's barely a rapport with you, even if you have a couple of kids. The way that our modern medical system is set up is they don't really have the time, the bandwidth to really build a healthy working relationship with you, your family, your child. Yes, you get to know them, quote unquote, over time, but it's stressful. Kids are sick. Kids are grumpy. There's so many variables that don't support your pediatrician getting to really know your child. And I can't tell you how many times pediatricians that I've known and worked with and trust for medical input, but they'll call me and they say, Erin, you see kids a child 2 or 3 times a week for 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 weeks, of course, you're going to have a better understanding of their skill set. And so what I want to empower parents to do is to get the information that I have access to use, and you guys really begin to use it in real time at home with your family. Sorry. So the systems, even if you look at a daycare center or a preschool or even a kindergarten setting, it takes months and months and months, honestly, for teachers to get to know your child, because there are 10, 20, 50, 30 other kids at any given time. And even if a teacher is very skilled, they don't really get to the nitty-gritty of what your child is capable of doing. As a practitioner, I spend, undivided attention, 45 minutes, 60 minutes in a small room. It's very structured. It's just the child and me. They have me in it with them, and I get to know them pretty darn well in a short amount of time. You, mom and dad, can do this too. All you need is to really the time and the mental bandwidth to sit down and look at little developmental snippets, right? To look at, if you have a 9-month-old, what are the ranges? What am I supposed to be focusing on? How can I clear my daily life, clear the environment so my 9-month-old or my 24-month-old or my 30-month-old can be working and growing and developing and enhancing his natural abilities in real time with me. So that's kind of my overall input, or my overall recommendation about the importance of developmental milestones. We use it to help gauge where a child is, to help gauge their growth, to help gauge and target certain areas that we want to focus on. And they are incredibly valid. But there are ranges, like I said. So understand how they all fit together: the speech and language, the motor, the cognition, the social engagement, the self-regulation. All of these pieces fit together to make a whole child grow and learn and develop to the best of their ability, and how parents have the tools, if they really, really are open to learning, of what's important from what's not important. And don't leave it up to the kids. Don't leave it up to the school systems or your daycare center or any of that, because in our modern life, and I've mentioned this before, that it becomes pretty tricky. Our lives are busy. We tend to overschedule. We're moving in the car and out of the car and in the car and out of the car, which then inhibits natural growth or physical enhancement. It's just a busy time. And if we can keep it more simple, keep it more concrete, keep it close to home, you, mom and dad, need to become the detective. Be informed, be prepared, be proactive. You're the number one advocate your child will ever have. You literally have the research at your fingertips with the internet these days. Ask questions. If you don't like the answers, ask more questions. If you don't like those answers, go seek a second opinion and a third opinion. Listen to your gut, because that's your internal voice. You're connected to your children like no one else. And even with me, even with this advice that I give you, or my impressions over 35 years of practice with kids, check it out. Don't take my word for it. Continue to be your own detective. I'm kind of your cheerleader. I'm going to give you some paths to look down and seek your answers. That's what's best for you. So developmental milestones are important. And They should not be changed loosey-goosey. But they're data points that will help us figure out where our kids are and how we can serve them the best. So that's it for today. I hope that you understand my 3 takeaways: to be your own detective. Don't take sweeping generalizations because they're misleading. And don't ever take the wait and see approach with your children, whether they're 2 or 20, right? It's always better to get some clear answers and to know upfront and to be prepared. That's kind of my motto these days. So thank you so much for spending your precious time with me once again. I would really, really appreciate it if you could take your time to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, as well as write a review if you like what you hear. Let me know. Reach out to me through Instagram or on Facebook. DM me if there's something specific you want to ask me, or if there's an area that you want me to kind of share at least my experience and see if that can be helpful. So again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to next week. Until then, remember, play, have fun, be purposeful, and just be present. Be there in the moment with your kids. They will love you for it. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.